In the spring of 1862, 20,000 men camped beside a tiny church called Shiloh, a Hebrew word meaning place of peace. Within 48 hours, it became the bloodiest ground in American history. Over 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Men drowned in a pond turned crimson with blood. And the generals who survived were never the same again. This is the Battle of Shiloh, and it was far more terrifying than you have ever been told. The land was soft with spring. April 5, 1862. Pittsburgh Landing, southwestern Tennessee. Along the muddy banks of the Tennessee River, the men of Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee lounged in the warm spring sunshine. The peach trees were blooming in soft pink clouds. The air smelled of wildflowers and fresh-cut wood. One Illinois volunteer wrote home that evening, "The boys are enjoying themselves hugely, lying in the shade, barefoot, collars open, the most complete picture of laziness I ever saw." They had every reason to feel at ease. Grant's army had just scored two of the most significant Union victories of the entire war, the capture of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, back in February. The great Confederate defensive line in the West had shattered. Nashville had fallen. Kentucky was firmly in Union hands. The war in the West, many believed, was nearly won. Grant himself was so confident that he camped 9 miles downriver at Savannah, Tennessee, waiting casually for reinforcements to arrive. He had not ordered his men to dig trenches or build defensive fortifications around their camps at Pittsburgh Landing. His second-in-command, General William Tecumseh Sherman, the man personally commanding the camps, later admitted with extraordinary candor, "I always acted on the supposition that we were an invading army. We did not fortify our camps against attack because we had no orders to do so, and because such a course would have made our men timid." 22 miles to the south, in the town of Corinth, Mississippi, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was doing anything but resting. Johnston was arguably the most respected military commander in the entire Confederacy. Confederate President Jefferson Davis considered him the finest general in America, North or South. Johnston had been gathering the shattered remnants of Confederate forces from across the Western Theater, pulling in troops from Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Kentucky. By late March, he had assembled an army of nearly 45,000 men, the largest Confederate force ever assembled in the Western Theater. He called it the Army of the Mississippi. Johnston had no intention of waiting for Grant and the approaching Army of the Ohio under General Don Carlos Buell to combine their forces. His plan was bold, almost reckless. He would march north, strike Grant's army before Buell arrived, destroy it completely, and reverse the entire course of the war in the West in a single devastating blow. On April 3, Johnston's massive army began moving northward through the dense Tennessee woodlands. The march was supposed to be a secret. It was anything but. The roads were a churned sea of mud from spring rains. Artillery pieces sank axle deep. Supply wagons overturned. Inexperienced soldiers fired their muskets accidentally. At one point, a Confederate regimental band struck up Dixie in full musical glory. Johnston's co-commander, General P.G.T. Beauregard, urged Johnston to call off the attack, certain the element of surprise had been lost. Johnston refused. "I would fight them if they were a million," he reportedly declared. The night before hell. The evening of April 5. The Confederate army had crept to within a mile of the outermost Union camps. In the darkness of the Tennessee woods, 45,000 Confederate soldiers crouched between the trees, loading their weapons, whispering prayers, writing final letters by candlelight they dared not fully expose. At the Union camps, warning signs were everywhere. Union cavalry scouts reported Confederate cavalry in the surrounding woods. A patrol from the 25th Missouri Infantry had clashed with Confederate skirmishers on April 4 and brought back prisoners. Some officers sent urgent messages warning of Confederate troops massing nearby. Sherman dismissed nearly all of it. In a message that would haunt him for years, he wrote to Grant, "I do not apprehend anything like an attack upon our position." It was, perhaps, the most catastrophically wrong assessment in the entire history of the American Civil War. One man who was not so dismissive was Colonel Everett Peabody of the 25th Missouri. Deeply unsettled by the prisoner reports and the sounds filtering through the dark woods, Peabody made a decision on his own authority that likely saved the entire Union Army from complete annihilation. Without orders from anyone above him, he dispatched a 300-man reconnaissance patrol into the woods before dawn to find out what was out there. They found out very quickly. At approximately 5:14 in the morning of Sunday, April 6, Major James E. Powell's patrol blundered directly into the forward line of Johnston's 45,000-man Confederate army. Musket fire crackled through the foggy woods. Powell sent a galloping rider back to camp. "The rebels are out here in force." Within minutes, the world changed forever. The storm breaks, dawn, April 6. The Confederate assault began at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. 3 full corps of Confederate infantry, men stretching for nearly 3 miles across, came crashing out of the trees in a screaming gray wave. The noise was described by survivors as something beyond human comprehension. Thousands of muskets firing simultaneously, artillery thundering from every direction, men screaming the bone-chilling Confederate battle cry. Union soldiers were caught in every stage of their morning routines, cooking breakfast, feeding horses, polishing buttons, writing letters home. Some were still in their tents. Some were barefoot. Many had stacked their muskets and were sitting around campfires with tin cups of coffee. The Confederate onslaught hit them like a hurricane hitting a summer picnic. The Southernmost Union Division, commanded by Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss, took the first and most devastating blow. Prentiss's men were raw recruits, many of whom had never loaded a musket under fire. Some panicked immediately and ran. Others stood their ground with remarkable courage. Prentiss himself rode among his men on horseback, screaming orders, trying to hold a line that was disintegrating by the minute. At Sherman's headquarters, the general stepped outside and raised his field glasses toward the tree line. What arrived was not a scouting party, it was a Confederate soldier taking careful aim directly at him from less than 100 yards away. The musket ball grazed Sherman's hand and killed the orderly standing next to him. According to legend, the only words Sherman spoke were, "My God, we are attacked." He immediately sent a galloping rider to Grant. Then Sherman did something that would define his military reputation for the rest of the war. He stayed in the saddle, rode to the most dangerous points of the line, and fought with a ferocity that astonished even his enemies. He had 3 horses shot from under him before noon. Grant, 9 miles away, heard the distant thunder of the cannon and knew immediately what it meant. Already hobbling on crutches from a horse-riding accident, he boarded a steamboat and raced upriver toward the sound of the guns. By the time he arrived at Pittsburgh Landing at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, the situation was catastrophic. The hornet's nest. By mid-morning, the Confederate assault had driven the Union line back more than a mile. Thousands of panicked soldiers streamed toward Pittsburgh Landing, huddling under the river bluff in a shivering, demoralized mass that eyewitnesses estimated at more than 10,000 men. But not everyone ran. Along a small, sunken farm road near the center of the battlefield, a quiet little track only about 3 feet below the level of the surrounding ground, Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss made a stand that would become one of the most legendary defensive actions in all of American military history. Prentiss rallied the broken fragments of several Union divisions, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men in total, along this sunken road and ordered them to hold at all costs. They crouched behind the slight embankment of the road, behind trees and fence rails, and began firing into the advancing Confederate formations with a deadly accuracy that stopped the gray tide cold. The Confederates launched assault after assault. Some historians count as many as 12 separate charges against the sunken road position. Each time, they came forward in organized lines across open fields, and each time, Prentiss's men cut them down. The bullets flying through the hickory and oak trees made a sound that Confederate soldiers described as exactly like a nest of enormous, furious hornets. From that description was born the name, the Hornet's Nest. Confederate artillery commander Colonel Daniel Ruggles grew so frustrated that he assembled the most massive concentration of artillery seen on the North American continent to that date, 62 cannon, wheel to wheel, aimed directly at the Hornet's Nest. When this thundering battery opened fire simultaneously, the noise was described by survivors as a physical force, a wall of sound and concussion that shook the ground for miles around. Trees shattered. Men were lifted off their feet by the shockwave. The air itself seemed to catch fire. And still Prentiss held. He held for 6 hours. 6 hours of unrelenting combat, assault after assault, artillery bombardment after artillery bombardment. By 5:30 in the afternoon, Prentiss's position was completely surrounded. His ammunition was running out. With nearly 2,200 of his soldiers captured and no possibility of escape, Prentiss surrendered. But those 6 hours had given Grant something priceless: time. The general's blood. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Confederate Commander Albert Sidney Johnston rode forward through the battle smoke to personally direct an attack on the Union's left flank. Johnston was everywhere that day, riding through the fire, rallying his troops, leading charges, inspiring men who were beginning to tire and waver. He carried a small tin cup he had given to a Union surgeon, with the instruction to use it to tend to the enemy's wounded. Even in the madness of battle, Johnston held to a personal code of honor. At some point during the afternoon, fighting near the Peach Orchard, where Union soldiers had been driven from a position amid trees still bearing their delicate pink blossoms, now fluttering down through gun smoke, Johnston was struck by a bullet in the right knee. It severed the popliteal artery. Johnston felt the wound but believed it was minor. He continued to direct the battle. His aide noticed he was swaying in the saddle and caught him as he began to fall. Johnston's personal physician had been sent away earlier that afternoon. Johnston had ordered him to tend to wounded Union prisoners. It was an act of generosity that cost the Confederacy everything. Within 30 minutes of being wounded, Albert Sidney Johnston bled to death in a hollow beneath a tree on the battlefield. He was the highest-ranking officer on either side to die in combat during the entire American Civil War. The effect on Confederate morale was devastating. General P.G.T. Beauregard assumed command. But Beauregard did not have Johnston's driving aggressive instinct. Without him, momentum began to slow. That evening, as the sun set on a battlefield carpeted with the dead and dying, Beauregard sent a telegram to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. "We this morning attacked the enemy in strong position in front of Pittsburgh, and after a severe battle of 10 hours, thanks be to the Almighty, gained a complete victory." It was premature. Catastrophically, fatally premature. The Bloody Pond and the Night of Terror. As darkness fell over Shiloh on the evening of April 6, the battlefield became something out of a nightmare. Approximately 16,000 men lay wounded across the blood-soaked ground, more than had been wounded in all previous battles of the entire war combined. The screaming of the injured filled the night air without ceasing, a sound that survivors described decades later as the most terrible thing they had ever heard. In a small depression near the center of the battlefield, a natural pond had become the only source of water for hundreds of desperately wounded soldiers from both sides, Union and Confederate alike, who dragged themselves through the mud to reach it. So many men died in and around this pond, bleeding into the water, that it turned a deep crimson red. History would record its name as Bloody Pond, and it still exists today. The night brought two additional terrors. The first was a brutal spring thunderstorm that rolled in off the Tennessee River, drenching the battlefield in cold rain, turning the ground into a sea of black mud. Some men, too weak to move, drowned in the rising puddles. Others died of exposure. The second terror came from the river itself. Union gunboats, the Lexington and the Tyler, began firing massive shells into the Confederate positions at regular intervals throughout the night. Every 15 minutes, enormous exploding shells shrieked through the darkness and detonated with thunderous force. The Confederates, trying to rest and reorganize, could not sleep. The relentless bombardment, combined with the rain and the cries of the wounded, created an atmosphere of psychological horror that broke the nerve of many Confederate soldiers before morning came. And while the Confederates endured the night in misery, Grant was receiving exactly what he needed most: reinforcements. General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio had arrived, 18,000 fresh troops. General Lew Wallace's division also arrived, adding another 7,000 men. Grant walked the battlefield that night in the rain. Sherman found him sitting under a tree, hat pulled low, a cigar clenched in his teeth, and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant looked up. "Yes," he replied quietly. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though." The counterattack, April 7th. At dawn on April 7th, Grant struck back. With 45,000 men, many of them fresh and rested, the Union Army advanced across the entire length of the battlefield. The Confederate army that faced them was not the same force that had swept forward so confidently the morning before. They were exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually broken by 2 days of brutal combat. Many had not eaten since the march from Corinth. Ammunition was running low. Their commander was dead. And now the Yankees were coming straight at them with the fury of men who had nearly been destroyed and were not about to let it happen again. The fighting on the second day was just as ferocious as the first. Confederate soldiers fought with desperate courage, inflicting heavy casualties at every turn. But the weight of numbers was overwhelming. Unit by unit, position by position, the Confederate line was forced backward. Back through the Hornet's Nest, back through the Peach Orchard, back past the place where Johnston had died, back through Shiloh Church itself. By early afternoon, General Beauregard recognized that the battle was lost. He ordered a general retreat toward Corinth. The Confederate army began pulling back through the same Tennessee woodlands it had marched through 2 days earlier in such high spirits. This retreat was nothing like that march. Men staggered from wounds. Officers wept openly. Ambulances overloaded with screaming wounded jolted over muddy roads. The Union pursuit was half-hearted. When Sherman advanced toward a place called Fallen Timbers, his column was attacked by Confederate cavalry under Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest personally charged so far ahead of his own troops that he suddenly found himself completely surrounded by Union soldiers. Shot through the side at point-blank range, Forrest used superhuman strength to haul a Union soldier up onto his horse as a human shield and galloped back through the Union lines to safety. The Union troops, shaken, retreated, allowing the Confederate army to escape to Corinth. The reckoning. When the shooting finally stopped, the full scale of what had happened slowly became apparent to a stunned nation. Over the 2 days of fighting, more than 23,000 soldiers had been killed, wounded, captured, or gone missing. Union forces suffered approximately 13,000 casualties. The Confederacy lost over 10,000 men. These numbers exceeded the combined casualties of every battle of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War combined. More men had fallen at Shiloh in 2 days than in any battle ever fought on North American soil in all of prior history. The nation was not ready for this. Neither side had truly understood, not in their hearts, what kind of war this was going to be. Shiloh stripped away every illusion. Grant was savaged in the Northern press. Newspapers screamed that he had been caught sleeping, drunk, unprepared, criminally negligent. Critics called for his immediate removal. President Abraham Lincoln, facing enormous political pressure, reportedly responded, "I can't spare this man, he fights." The Confederacy never recovered from the shock of Shiloh. The loss of Albert Sidney Johnston was a blow from which Confederate fortunes in the West never truly recovered. Corinth fell to Union forces by the end of May. Within a year, Grant would complete the strangling of the Confederacy at Vicksburg. In the South too, Shiloh shattered illusions. The confident belief that Southern valor would simply overpower the larger Union armies died on that Tennessee battlefield. Shiloh was the moment many historians point to as the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, even if the end itself was still 3 long, brutal years away. Today, the Shiloh National Military Park in Hardin County, Tennessee, is one of the most beautifully preserved Civil War battlefields in existence. The peach trees still bloom every April. The sunken road is still there. Bloody Pond still sits in its hollow, dark and quiet. Shiloh Church, rebuilt after the war, still stands on the same ground. Visitors walk the same fields where men screamed and fell in their thousands. The silence there has a weight to it that is unlike ordinary silence. It is the silence of 3,500 Americans who died on that ground, men who came from farms and shops and schools in Illinois and Tennessee and Mississippi and Ohio, who had never wanted to kill anyone, who fought with extraordinary courage on both sides, and who paid with everything they had. Shiloh. Place of peace. A small wooden church in a Tennessee spring. 2 days that changed America forever. And a story far more terrifying, and far more human, than most people have ever been told.